So this next section, I'm really, really pleased about to introduce Kerryn Phelps. Kerryn's going to talk about 8 months that changed Australia. And I had a long introduction, but I'm not going to actually go there because I want, more importantly, to hear what she's got to say. But the two things I want to share with you is the numbers, because we've been talking a lot yesterday about how important it is to know your numbers. So in introducing Kerryn, I actually want to give you the numbers from the 2018 by-election. So the Liberal candidate received 32,000, 43% of the vote, and Kerryn got 29% of the vote. So she clearly needed preferences. And when the preferences flowed, Kerryn went from 29% to 51%. And the Liberal went from 32 to 37. So you can see that Kerryn harvested most of the preferences. So she was the most preferred candidate. So that was why she won in 2018. And in 2019, something very similar happened, but it just wasn't enough. So in 2019, the first preferences, Kerryn was 47.44. The Liberal, was 47.44, and Kerryn was 32%. So she was still below it. And Kerryn went from 32 to 49% on preferences. But the Liberal, he went from 47 to 51. And it was only 2,000 votes, but that 2,000 votes made the difference. So Kerryn lost the second election, and even though she got a huge number of new votes, it just wasn't enough to actually get her over the line. So it's a salutary lesson for us. You've got to get your numbers right. And not to say Kerryn didn't get her numbers right, she just couldn't get enough. So in introducing you, I just want to say, Kerryn, I'm so looking forward to you sharing a story with us, but I just want to capture the love I have for you and the joy that you gave me when, with my very good crossbench colleague, Rebecca Sharkey, she and I on either side of you, and you in your deep navy blue, we walked the three of us together down that aisle of Parliament House, and everybody stood, and then as you took your oath, in fact, you didn't take an oath, you took an allegiance, everybody clapped. And it was so heartwarming because when I first went into Parliament, I was the only woman on the crossbench. And when I left, there was 4 of us. And having you there was just magnificent. So I'm now going to hand you over. Very keen to hear your words of wisdom and your story. 8 months that changed Australia. Over to you, Kerryn Phelps.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you, everyone. And just congratulations to everyone who's organising this convention. I think it's a really watershed moment in Australian politics for so many people to get together in this way and to really have a look at the role that independents can play in the political landscape. Now, Kathy has asked me to do a presentation today about 7 or 8 months that changed Australian politics, the role of people, preferences, policies, politics and power in Wentworth from October 2018 to May 2019. And so in discussing this presentation with Kathy, we decided that what I ought to do is to tell you a story. And I think that in telling the story, a lot of lessons will come from that. Lessons that in my case were often hard won. And as is so often the case for independents and particularly for people who are doing something for the first time. I think it's fair to say that the Wentworth by-election was not my first foray into the federal political arena. In 2000, I was elected as president of the Australian Medical Association. And so Jackie and I had an apartment set up in Canberra because we spent so much of our week there. And along with all of the expected issues that were managed by the AMA, like the medical workforce, aged care, Medicare reforms, under my presidency, we expanded our agenda to cover a really wide range of social and ethical issues. And some of the issues that I was determined to place on the agenda included things like climate change and human health. It was the first time that the medical profession had had a policy on climate change and human health. We fought for the rights of refugee children to be taken out of detention. We said that we needed to be prepared via terrorism attacks. We talked about physician-assisted dying. We developed the first position statement on gender and sexuality. And we also developed the first Indigenous health report card to encourage the states to lift their game in that area. So you will notice some very familiar themes emerging from those times 20 years ago with the AMA, issues that still need to be addressed today. And of course, that wasn't my only association with federal politics, because between 1998 and 2017, Jackie and I were the two of the leaders of the marriage equality campaign. The late 90s coincided with the beginning of our national conversation on marriage equality. And when Jackie and I returned from our wedding ceremony in New York, although it wasn't legally recognised anywhere in the world at that time, it started Australia thinking and talking about the right to equality for same-sex couples. So this kept me engaged with federal politics consistently over the years as we lobbied and argued our case with all parties right across the political spectrum. And along the way, over 85 discriminatory federal laws were changed, as well as state laws on issues like same-sex adoption and age of consent laws. And so that was a consistent engagement with federal politics. And I must say, after 20 long years of advocacy, the result of the postal survey was announced on the 15th of November 2017, and the majority of Australians said that they'd voted yes. And what an emotional and extraordinary moment that was. And just a few weeks later, Jackie and I were in the Speaker's Gallery in the House of Representatives on the 7th of December 2017, little knowing that I would be there less than a year later as a Member of Parliament, when the overwhelming majority of MPs voted for equality. And I think all of us in Australia remember where we were at that moment when that vote was announced. And I think that that day, more than any other in our history, showed us the Australian Parliament at its best. It marked the end of 2 decades of activism for us, but it also marked, I believe, a change in the Australian political psyche, was that things could be done differently for the right causes. Now, this brings me to my election as a councillor on the City of Sydney in 2016. You'll see that there's some overlap in some of these dates that I'm talking about. I was elected as number 2 on Clover Moore's ticket as part of a so-called independent team, but our political relationship didn't last. Now, I won't go into the details of why that happened. I said a little bit in the media, but I will say a couple of things, that there were certain understandings I believe that we had that were recanted just days after the election in 2016, and that my experience was that an independent team was independent in name only, and independent thinking and expression and voting, as most of us would understand the term, was actually systematically discouraged. This was a group that operated in many ways just like a party. But that's a story for another occasion, but the experience certainly informed my ideas about the importance of being a true independent. Now, one of the things that I want to talk to you about today is the role of people, and all of the presentations in the last couple of days have really emphasised how important people are in independent representation. Early in 2018, a group of close confidants of mine started meeting with the aim of running a campaign for Lord Mayor of Sydney in the 2020 election. Now, that election was due to be held last year, but it was postponed because of COVID-19 to September of this year. And that has been a very transparent intention of mine back to 2016. Our group had expertise in finance, in community engagement, in logistics and design. None of us had actually run a campaign before. Our planning was well underway with design work and policy frameworks when the Liberal hard right knifed Malcolm Turnbull. Then people started calling, they started emailing me, stopping me in the street and tweeting, asking me to stand for Wentworth. I had some pivotal meetings with a number of people, including Bill Botel, who's been very prominent in the COVID-19 pandemic debate, and Wendy McCarthy, who told me that they believe that an independent with a strong local connection could win Wentworth in a by-election. I was a local GP, had been a local GP in Double Bay for nearly 20 years, and I had those strong connections. I had a real determination to do something about the climate change issue and the treatment of refugees and the lurch to the right of the Liberal Party. And what I saw was a very disturbing direction that the country was taking. And clearly that idea was shared by many. Part of what I've always done is to think, now, why doesn't someone do something about that? And then you look around and quite often you're the person who is in a position to do something about it. And then you have to explain to yourself why you don't do something about it. Well, I assessed my chances of success in Wentworth as highly unlikely, given that Malcolm Turnbull's two-party preferred majority meant that we needed close to 20% swing to wrench the seat from the tight grasp of the Liberals. In fact, the seat had always been held by a Conservative throughout its history. So in retrospect, what were we thinking? It came to a decision time for our fledgling organising group. I wouldn't be able to run this campaign on my own, not by a long shot. We held a meeting of our core group in our home in Potts Point, and then I recused myself to give all of the others a chance to express how they really felt about it, whether they felt they wanted to put their effort into a federal by-election campaign, and then they had a vote on it. So when I was called back into the room, we had made the switch from planning for a distant local government election to now a pop-up federal by-election campaign with just over a month to pull together a full campaign. I had to deflect media speculation for about 10 days while we frantically worked out whether we could pull it together in that relatively short time in terms of logistics. We announced on the 16th of September. Now, these timelines are important because even in retrospect, at the time it seemed really tight, but in retrospect, I think you'll agree that it was almost miraculous. We announced on the 16th of September, and the election was to be held on the 20th of October, 2018. We needed a seasoned campaign management team, and I was introduced by my old friend and mentor, Wendy McCarthy, who became our campaign chair, to Darren Barnett and Anthony Reid. Now, Darren had worked in Julia Gillard's office when she was Prime Minister, and they had both had campaign experience. We found office space. Again, I don't know how we did that, in Edgecliff, in the Wentworth electorate for that month's period. The word was out and people just started turning up at our office. They told us what their skill set was and we put them to work. And to be honest, most of the time we were just winging it. In that crazy month, Wentworth was the only show in town. It was the only show in the country. There were 16 candidates, all seeing the potential to raise their particular issues. The Liberals held a snap pre-selection and they chose Dave Sharma. He was a former advisor to Alexander Downer and a former ambassador to Israel with no connection to the electorate. The national media descended on the electorate, and so did every activist group, from Get Up to Stop Adani, Friends of the ABC, Extinction Rebellion, refugee advocates and animal rights advocates, and the Dying with Dignity lobby. I spoke at candidate forums, held press conferences, stood at train stations and ferry stops. We door knocked as much as we could. And if you've never door knocked, it should be on your bucket list as a life experience. We had to do a lot of listening and a lot of talking. And I tell you, there is nothing like an election campaign to have you know so much more about your electorate than you ever thought you did before. Now, the next P word is preferences. Independents are likely to need preferences because it's a really high bar to get over 50% plus one vote on first preferences, especially in seats that have been long held by one of the major political parties where people tend to vote relatively automatically and tribally. In the Wentworth by-election, we were tapping into a deep anger at Malcolm Turnbull's ousting and a deep vein of satisfaction with the lurch of the Liberal Party to the right and the lack of action on climate change. On the 16th of September 2018, the day that I made the announcement, a group of about 40 of us, family and friends, dressed in the purple t-shirts that became very recognisable, you can see them there, and we met in the car park of our clinic in Double Bay, and we marched along Knox Street to the waiting media scrum in Kiora Lane behind the Woollahra Library. It was there that I announced my intention to run. We had certainly discussed policy, but there was a minor detail that we hadn't actually discussed, and that was preferences. And so I think I was asked the question by a journalist about preferences, and my initial response was, put the Liberals last, because I thought they'd been behaving so badly. Well, that really set the cat amongst the pigeons. I was told, no, it's a Liberal heartland seat. What are you doing? Telling a Conservative election you want to put the Liberals last will write you off. If you win, the government loses its one-seat majority and Wentworth will want you to assure them that you won't block supply. Yes, they said you can't preference anyone but Liberals if you want to have a chance of winning, I was told. Well, we had an emergency meeting. Words were not minced. I won't use some of the more colourful expressions, but the gist of it went along the lines of, you're going to have to rip off the Band-Aid. Well, the opportunity to rip off that Band-Aid came just a few days later on the 20th of September. Jackie and I were down in Bondi with a group of our volunteers, and we got a phone call that Scott Morrison and Dave Sharma were about to do a press conference in Transvaal Avenue in Double Bay. Up to this point, we hadn't clapped eyes on Dave Sharma, so we thought, here's a chance to rock up and disrupt the proceedings. We drove into Double Bay and parked the car. Several of our purple-clad people who had been swarming to the electorate had arrived a bit earlier. They told me that Dave Sharma had seen me arrive and had bolted. Scott Morrison was nowhere to be seen. The national media was all set up in the centre strip of Transvaal Avenue. We waited and we waited and we waited. We waited for about half an hour. Word went around the journalists that Morrison and Sharma had pulled the plug. Well, we got together, we discussed what to do, and we thought, why waste an opportunity like this? So flanked on either side by my volunteers in their purple shirts, I ripped off the Band-Aid. I would be preferencing the Liberals. I think that was the first time I'd ever been accused of backflipping on anything except a springboard at a swimming pool. That was my first lesson in preferencing as an independent. You can't. So we next move on to the support of other independents. And I just want to say a word about how important this was. I was contacted, of course, I'd heard of Cathy McGowan and Rebecca Sharkey, but we hadn't met. And I was soon contacted by Cathy, who offered to come to Sydney and give me some worldly advice, and you might call it a survival guide. Now, I have to say, it wasn't just the words of survival guide, but because before the election came around, Cathy actually sent me a survival box of things that would help me to be able to get through the campaign. And also Rebecca Sharkey came to Sydney for the day to campaign alongside me as well, and to help me out with some media too. And that was just so important to know that in the unlikely event that I was to win, that I wouldn't be alone in Canberra. So the next P word is policies. It all came down to that all-important matter of the policies that I was going to put to the electorate. We knew we had to present a full suite of federal policies. This is a very informed electorate. And as the electorate drew closer, I knew that I would need to answer some very detailed questions about my position on pretty much everything. After all, the electorate would need to know what I stood for. And I didn't have the advantage of a party platform. It turned out that our team in the campaign office had quite the network. And before long, we had meetings with experts across a range of policy areas. Jackie and I had met a fellow poodle owner in the park, and one day she turned up in the office as a volunteer. And it turned out that Lynn Ralph was a recognised expert in financial services and superannuation, and she was able to help us develop policy in those areas. We met with friends of the ABC about funding for the national public broadcaster, as well as leaders in the creative arts. I was one of the ABC alumni myself, of course, having worked on the Everybody Health program at the ABC some years before. John Hewson, a former leader of the Liberal Party and one of my predecessors as member for Wentworth, sat down with me for hours talking to me about the complexities of the economics of climate change. Tim Buckley schooled me on the fossil fuel industry. Anne Summers provided us with the foundation for our women's policy. I went surfing with world champion Lane Beachley at Bondi to protest oil drilling in the Great Australian Bight and its potential impact on our oceans and our beaches. I spoke at a conference in Bondi on ocean plastics. I joined protests against the proposed Adani coal mine. And even though Wentworth was very light on sheep farms, it is strong on animal rights. And banning live sheep exports became a much bigger issue than any of us had ever anticipated. Physician-assisted dying or dying with dignity had a candidate, Shane Higginson, and she asked for my support for changes to the legislation along the lines of the Victorian legislation. And I needed to speak to the chair of that particular campaign, that inquiry in Victoria, who happened to be one of my predecessors as an AMA president. A group of retired judges met with me to explain the need for a Federal Integrity Commission and how that would work. The hashtag Kids Off Nauru campaign had really just kicked off in August by coincidence, and the by-election campaign became a lightning rod for protests against refugee children being held indefinitely in horrific circumstances on Nauru. I met with Daniel Gieselbash, a young academic who was an expert in refugee law from Macquarie University on many occasions, and he helped me to develop policy on indefinite offshore detention, along with a speed course in international refugee law. For the Liberals, they just went with a vote for Phelps is a vote for Labor and Bill Shorten, along with a scare campaign about the horrors of a hung parliament. Now we come to the politics. In the weeks before the election, the electorate was engaged in politics in a way I have never seen before. And I could tell that sentiment was in my favour. Whether that was enough to carry us over the line to an election victory was anyone's guess. And I knew it would certainly come down to preferences. And I had learnt quite a bit about preferences in that few weeks, somewhat painfully. We had to make the most of every dollar donated. And we were up against the might of the Liberal Party with their huge donor base. And every time we put up corflutes on Telegraph polls, they were mysteriously torn down. There were false rumours that were started about my medical fees and my medical practice. And another thing became really clear too. All of the Liberal leaflets and letterbox drops and the advertising and the robocalls focused on me. It was as if the other 14 candidates suddenly didn't exist. Our cause was helped along by a series of own goals by the Liberals, whose campaign was frankly pretty clumsy, particularly in the last couple of weeks. There was a $2 million pledge to Liberal-dominated Bronte Surf Club, a promise to introduce legislation to end discrimination in religious schools, which never eventuated, a wildly controversial announcement that they would move the Australian Embassy in Israel to Jerusalem to appeal to the Jewish community, without them really understanding that not even the entire Jewish community agreed with a move like that, certainly not as an announcement in a by-election campaign. They were looking chaotic and they were looking panicked. So the night before the election, well, of course, we had the several weeks of pre-polling during that short period of time. And the night before the election, we found every polling place literally wrapped in plastic, depicting me and Bill Shorten in my campaign colours. So that really cemented the idea for people walking into polling booths that this was a two-horse race, Liberal versus Phelps. After weeks of pre-polling, it came to election day. We started before dawn with our volunteers setting up for the day, literally jostling for position with squadrons of young Liberals and other party faithful in their light blue or their red T-shirts. We had a catering team who would go from booth to booth, delivering snacks, lunches and water and checking on our volunteers' well-being. I tried to physically get to as many booths as I could on the day. Polls closed at 6 p.m, the exact moment a massive thunderstorm rolled over the Sydney area. Our team of volunteer scrutineers arrived at each polling booth, and some of our volunteers from the day stayed over after a very long day that started around 4 a.m. to supervise the counting so that we had the numbers there. A small group of us gathered in our lounge room in Potts Point to watch the election results come in. We were casually dressed in our trackies, and we dug in for what we expected would be a long night after a very long few weeks. And then an extraordinary thing happened. Around 7:30 p.m. that night, Anthony Green made the call on the ABC. In his opinion, it was a clear victory for me. Well, we were in shock. We had achieved the almost 20% swing we needed to win the seat, and the government had lost its one-seat majority. So Jackie, Wendy McCarthy and I got in a car together and we headed for North Bondi Surf Club, where we had booked what we thought would be a commiseration party to thank all of our volunteers and supporters for such a huge effort, but it became a victory celebration well into the night. The next morning, Sunday, I was due to appear on The Insiders on the ABC and on the early morning TV programs and other radio programs on other networks. And as I went off air at the ABC, I heard Peter Van Onselen in the studio say something like, "I have information coming through that the postal votes are strongly in favour of the Liberal Dave Sharma. The result may not be as clear-cut as we think." Okay, so that sent us into a little bit of turmoil for the next couple of weeks because Dave Sharma never conceded. The Liberals dragged it out for another 2 weeks, well after the result was clear, and we were forced to wait for the Electoral Commission to formally declare the result. I'd won by 1,851 votes. It was the 4th of November, 2018. Parliament was due to sit on the 26th of November. That meant I had just 22 days to set up an office, employ a chief of staff, a media manager, and 5 electoral staff, set up all of our processes, get across the legislative agenda, write a maiden speech, and find somewhere to stay in Canberra. I felt the pressure of making sure that my first speech was worthy of what we call in medicine the retrospectoscope. That is, it had to have the potential to stand the test of time. I wanted to focus on the theme of the human experience and how that is impacted by political decisions. In my non-existent spare time, I worked up a draft, including some stories from my family history, my own journey, my statement of values, and a vision for the future. Meanwhile, back at the office, for the sake of convenience and to save the government money, we decided to move into Malcolm Turnbull's former headquarters. When we arrived, the place had been absolutely stripped bare. There was not a single piece of paper, not a single computer record, not a word of formal handover of any of the electoral matters like immigration appeals or grants processes, nothing. We had to build from zero in under 3 weeks. Eventually, one of Malcolm Turnbull's former staff did come in for a few days to provide us with something of a handover of the more urgent matters. Even after an intense and exhausting campaign, some of our amazing volunteers stayed on to help, and they helped with that transition, and I'll be forever grateful to them for putting their own lives on hold for a cause in which they so strongly believed. So let's move forward that 22 days to the 26th of November 2018, my first day in Parliament. Cathy McGowan and Rebecca Sharkey, as Cathy said in the introduction, they talked me through the swearing-in process. They walked me to the door of the House of Representatives, and then as the doors swung open, they walked one on either side of me down the steps to the dispatch box. Their calm, their experienced presence was an incredible boost to my confidence. Later that day, I was scheduled to deliver that first speech. It was certainly a busy couple of weeks. As I rose to speak, Scott Morrison and most of the Liberal and National MPs to my left stood up and walked out of the chamber. The photographer, Alex Ellinghausen, caught the moment on camera. To my right was a totally different picture. Bill Shorten had asked all of his Labor MPs to stay for the speech. I really appreciated the respect that showed. All of the crossbenchers stayed too, even Bob Catter. Well, at least until I got to the part about being gay and marriage equality, and then he had something urgent to attend to somewhere else. Over that first week in Parliament, I was treated to daily threats to refer me to the High Court under Section 44 with no justification. My media manager, who had had some political experience, commented to me that he had never seen a case where the number of threats had outnumbered the number of days that someone had spent in Parliament. But at every press conference about any substantive issue, there would be one journalist or another quizzing me with obviously planted questions about my eligibility to serve in the Parliament. It must have driven them collectively mad to have to accept the result of that by-election, and they were trying every trick in the book to invalidate it or intimidate me. So the next day, the 27th of November, an extraordinary thing happened. The Liberal MP for Chisholm, Julia Banks, quit the Liberal Party and joined us on the crossbench. The crossbench now held the balance of power. And I want to talk a little bit about this and the balance of power. Now, much was said about the independence of the crossbenchers having this balance of power. And there was one day that I was out on my paddleboard on the harbour, and I thought to myself, what if we do have the balance of power? And because I was on my paddleboard, I was thinking about balance. And I thought, I think I'd rather think of it as the power of balance. Rather than government being able to just push legislation through the lower house with barely even a debate about its merits, here was an opportunity to do things differently, to introduce some fresh new ideas, influence the agenda, improve legislation. Who knew where this led? Was this the chaos that the people of Wentworth had been warned about? Maybe it was. but we soon found out just how much balance the crossbench could bring to the parliament. Enter Medivac. During the Wentworth by-election campaign, one of the big issues was Australia's treatment of refugees, as I said, specifically the Kids Off Nauru campaign and that festering sore that is Australia's policy of indefinite offshore detention of refugees who arrived by boat after the 19th of July 2013. Detention became indefinite because successive governments had failed to work out a resettlement plan for the people trapped in limbo by a reckless political ideology. One of my first meetings in Parliament House was with refugee advocates who were looking for support to find solutions to this chaotic policy area. So why did we need Medivac? Well, during the election campaign, I learned all I could about Australia's current policy on refugees and people seeking asylum and the history of that policy. I obviously knew a fair bit about it from 20 years before and had kept up to date to an extent, but not with the level of detail that I would need. In my first days in Parliament, I had a series of meetings with doctors and other healthcare workers, including Médecins Sans Frontières, people who had had first-hand knowledge of the situation on Nauru and Manus Island in Papua New Guinea, and the picture of an urgent humanitarian crisis emerged. Australia has a policy of indefinite offshore detention for people attempting to arrive, as I said, by boat after the 19th of July 2013. So you had traumatised people being punished for arriving on the wrong date by the wrong mode of transport. Ridiculous. There were reports of children who'd given up the will to live, diagnosed with a condition known as traumatic withdrawal syndrome. There were reports of physical and sexual violence. 13 people had died in offshore detention. I heard reports of urgently requested medical transfers, one after the other obstructed, where those transfers of critically ill people were achieved only through protracted legal action. One man, Hamid Karzai, had died from an infection in his leg because his urgent transfer was delayed. In 2016, the coroner in his case recommended changes to Australia's treatment of refugees in detention, but nothing happened. Nothing had happened for 20 years. Now, during those meetings with people on the front line, I asked what one thing they believed would have the most effect on improving the current impasse. If there was one thing we could achieve, what would that be? I was told that one thing was finding a way to get around the legal obstructions to medical transfers of critically ill people for treatment in Australia. Now, from my experience in the AMA, I thought this is a situation, and anyone who's in remote Australia will be familiar with this. This is the situation that the way we manage these sorts of cases in remote parts of Australia. When a medical condition can't be treated locally, the treating doctor will contact specialists in a larger centre with the equipment or the expertise to manage the case. If the treatment isn't possible locally, the patient is approved for transfer for treatment. Now, working with doctors who'd been on Nauru, they agreed a system like that would work. So we got to work drafting legislation. This is in my first 2 weeks in Parliament. My office became Medivac Central, and along with my own electorate staff and volunteers, including 2 lawyers on our team, we had up to 21 people working in our small space for that whole time. As we drafted the legislation on laptops, literally on our laps, we would test it with various legal minds around the country. And we had various members of the shadow cabinet coming and going, and members of the independent crossbench coming and going. And Kathy will remember you were just down the corridor. Rebecca's office was next door to mine. We had meetings with Bill Shorten, Anthony Albanese, Penny Wong, Tony Burke, Shane Newman, and Richard Di Natale to negotiate some political sensitivities, and in particular, any questions around national security. And we really did tie off any loose ends. On the last day of Parliament for the year, one of our advisors cleverly found a piece of legislation dealing with miscellaneous aspects of home affairs that was going to the Senate, because remembering we didn't have control of what could go into the House, but we could have something in the Senate as an amendment. So we decided this was miscellaneous and it was about home affairs. So we bolted it on, and then independent Senator Tim Storer introduced it into the Senate. And after a long filibuster by Senators Bernardi and Hanson, our legislation passed the Senate on that day by 1 vote. And you remember we waited anxiously all day for it to come back to the House of Reps, and we thought we'd have time for it to come to the House of Reps before Christmas break, but time was against us, and Scott Morrison closed Parliament for the year. And then over the Christmas break, the government tried every trick in the book to scare the Australian people into thinking that treating sick refugees somehow meant that we were going to flood the country with murderers, rapists and pedophiles, that people would be getting bumped off surgical waiting lists. They wouldn't get their knee replacements or their hip replacements. They'd be bumped off social housing lists, all false, of course, completely false. We'd have to wait until Parliament returned the following February for the legislation to come to the House, and with a few more negotiated amendments, it passed into law, again by one vote, with the support of Labor, the Greens and most of the independents, and that became known as the Medivac law. Of course, we had the legislation, but the government made no effort to set up the processes for making any of the changes demanded by the legislation to make sure that the protocols were there. And that fell to a group that became known as MERG, or the Medical Evacuation Response Group, hundreds of highly qualified medical specialists who volunteered their time to set up a robust process to assess cases and recommend transfers where that was medically the right course of action. So then we rolled forward to the federal election in May 2019. Just 7 months after the Wentworth by-election, we were back at the polls, again having to run a full federal campaign. And despite fulfilling all of the promises I made to the electorate, we lost by the narrowest of margins. In terms of the politics, most of the attention and the electoral donations had moved to Warringah, where Zali Steggall was taking on Tony Abbott in a massive battle. We gave it everything we had, but it was clear that the people of Wentworth didn't want a shortened government. They didn't want Labor's proposed changes to franking credits, and they didn't want to lose the ability to negatively gear investment properties. And so against the odds, we saw the return of the Morrison coalition government. The government made one of its top priorities after re-election the repeal of the Medivac legislation. With everything else the government had responsibility for, their top priority was to stop sick people getting medical care in Australia. The repeal of the legislation passed the Senate by one vote. Ironically, it was the vote of newly elected independent Senator Jackie Lambie. We don't know what she was told or what she was promised. We may never know, but it broke a lot of hearts. So what was the outcome of that 7 months and the landmark Medivac legislation? Well, all of the children were released from Nauru with their families by February of 2019. Hundreds of people were transferred to Australia under the Medivac law, and many are still locked up in detention or confined to so-called alternative places of detention, or APODs, which we also know in lay terms as hotels, in rooms without windows that open to fresh air. They're confined 24 hours a day, and they've been there for over a year. And that's on top of 7 years in mandatory detention on Manus Island and Nauru. Now, during the COVID-19 pandemic of the past year, many people have come to understand the impact of mandatory hotel quarantine for just 2 weeks. These people needing urgent medical attention were locked up for over a year after 7 years in offshore detention. Can't even open a window, no privacy, no access to friends and family. And just in the past few weeks, there have been 60 people who were unexpectedly released from these hotels into the Australian community. But today there are still 290 people held against their will in PNG and Nauru. And that's despite countless parliamentary and departmental inquiries, UN investigations, reports by the Australian Human Rights Commission, and whistleblowers who've repeatedly told us the same story of systematic abuse, violence, and medical neglect of people held in detention centres. That brief time that the independents held the power of balance in the House of Representatives, or the balance of power, showed us what can be done to shift the dial by doing politics differently. So what is the future for independents? My story will be familiar to many independents who have tried to mount an election campaign with little or no experience, minimal resources or infrastructure, and up against the might of the major parties. Few have done it with so little time to prepare. The important thing is to think about why we need independence. We need people who are community-minded. We need people in our parliament who represent the people, not a party. We need to be able to encourage better legislation through more nuanced and challenging debate. Every vote for an independent is a conscience vote. And this aspect that I talk about the power of balance, it's not about power, it's about balance. It takes the right candidates in the right electorates at the right time. The electorate of Hughes is one obvious example for the next election. What do independents need? They need policies that reflect the views of a significant number of people in their electorate. We need strong community connections and hundreds of volunteers to devote their time to campaigning. They need funding from donations. Any election is expensive. Infrastructure would help, including accounting and legal templates. Candidate briefings, including campaign strategies and materials, information about preferencing or not preferencing, but that conversation of, well, if you won't put me first, put me second. Volunteer training modules would be helpful. Training for electorate staff, because most staffers with experience have party political affiliation. And for example, Andrew Wilkie sent his chief of staff up to help our staff to set up, and that was absolutely invaluable. And I thank him very much for doing that. Our chief scrutineer made a video which we sent around to everyone who had volunteered to scrutineer, because most of our volunteers didn't even know what scrutineering meant. Media management is essential, particularly where budgets are tight. Now, I have to say that the way ahead has many challenges, and as dissatisfaction with the major parties grows and the sentiment towards community-minded, politically centrist independence increases, so too does the determination of the major parties to maintain the status quo. Australians, as we've heard over this weekend, are largely tribal, very tribal, and the major parties provide a tribe for people to identify with, and the major parties will continue to leverage this. But I sense a growing feeling that community-minded independents are becoming a tribe too. Where independents have been successful, they've rallied around a cause, worn the identifying colours, and engaged in the political process with a shared vision for a better world that they may not see reflected in the policies or the conduct of the major parties, where a conscience vote is a rarity. We now know that it can be done. Tony Windsor did it. So did Rob Oakeshott and Cathy McGowan, who passed the baton to Helen Haynes. Zali Steggall did it in Warringah. Jackie Lambie did it for Tasmania in the Senate, and I did it in Wentworth. I'm sometimes asked if it was worth it for just 7 months as an MP. Indeed, I sometimes ask myself the same question. The answer is an unqualified yes. Thank you. Over to you, Cathy.
Thank you, Kerryn. Oh my God, that was just magnificent. We've had a whole lot of questions and discussion, but I don't think we're even going to start on that, because a lot of them are technical questions. But I think the overriding thing is, can people have a copy of your speech?
So yes, I can send it to you. Yes.
Yeah, and we can then put it where we do it, because there's so much really good content in that we actually need to think about. And your call to action is so strong, and your personal testimony, I think, is what we've actually heard, that it's absolutely possible. Now it's 10 to 11, so I think I'm going to pass it back to Jill. We've got 5 minutes, Jill. So if we've got one question, there's a whole lot of technical questions about preferences, and we've covered that, and there's information about that, and there's books written about it. I actually want to talk to you about managing emotions, because you were the centre of all of Australia for that period of time, that by-election. And then the next election too was really, and as you described, the hecticness of it. And I think that's one of the huge things that all of us have got to actually manage: the public persona, the private persona, your family, and keeping it all together. So I'm really interested in a bit of reflection from you about some strategies you used to be the team leader of all those different teams. And now you're standing as to be the Lord Mayor of Sydney as well. So you're absolutely committed to community leadership and representation. So any wisdom you have for us on that would be really welcome.
That's a really important question, Cathy, because I think that it is an emotional roller coaster. And I did speak to somebody about some resilience strategies during that period of time that I was making the decision to run. And that was very helpful. But going back, from my very early days, I've always been involved in competitive sport. And one of the lessons I've always said to my children is that success is not just about winning, and that participating is a form of success in its own right. And I think that if you think you're going to go into every competition and come out the winner, then you have yourself deluded. And I think so. It's important to understand why you want to stand. And I said that there were 16 candidates at that election, and they all had different reasons for standing, but they were all passionate about a cause. And every single person that was standing knew that there was only going to be one person who would be elected as the MP, but they all felt that it was worth having a go, so that they could. I can't speak for the others, but I from the discussions that I had with them, it was about their passion for their community or about their passion for a particular cause. And in my case, it was about standing up for those important causes that I outlined in my speech. And it was about the direction that I saw the country heading, which I felt very uneasy about. And I thought, if not me, then who? And if not now, then when? And the moment was now. And Jackie and I have a policy between us in our relationship of a right of veto. So if one or other of us feels very strongly that you shouldn't go down a path, then the other one respects the partner's view on that, because you can't do something like this without the support of your family. And because it does have an impact on your family. And our daughter, who was and is still living at home, she actually was our organizer for our Young Purples, and she needed to be on board too, because it was going to affect her family life too. And of course, I talked about the meeting that we had with my support group, who were helping me develop a campaign for Lord Mayor of Sydney at the time, going back now almost 3 years. And they had to be on board because I needed their support too. And when we unexpectedly won, it was just the most amazing. I didn't see it as a personal victory at all. I saw it as a team victory, and I saw it as a signal that there was work to be done in those areas of issues that had become so important or had been shown to be so important during that campaign. And I said about putting every minute that I could into doing the most that I could during that 7 months. When it came around to the next election, I had to go into that next election prepared not to win it, but hoping very much that I could have 3 more years to be able to do more of that work. And it was monumentally disappointing not to have won that second election. But being a democracy, I think that you have to accept the will of the people in an election, and so it was. And I think the next election, whenever that is held, we'll just have to wait and see what Parliament the Australian people end up with. But I do hope that there are going to be a lot of independents who put their hands forward and give their communities the opportunity to have that choice.
Mm. There's 2 things that I'm really picked up from what you've said, and I'm going to talk about personal courage. So it was the personal courage to rip the Band-Aid off, because I can remember when I heard that you were going to put Liberals last. Oh my God, that's not going to work. And then that whole fuss about it, and how you were able to resurrect it and in fact win on preferences. So the courage to very quickly change. And then the other courage I've seen with you was I think the personal vindictiveness of this current government, and I'm going to name Scott Morrison with the Medivac stuff, like that was personal. He was so cross that us crossbenchers had voted him down, and he couldn't do anything about it. So as soon as he had his numbers, but that was really personally directed to you, I think. So can you talk a little bit about managing that personal vindictiveness that comes, you say about being competitive, but can you give us, because it happens to all of us, can you give us just some little clues of things to hold as we go out into this competitive world of making the world a better place when it gets very personal and it's us? Even though you've got the team, everybody else, that this is actually about you, Kerryn Phelps, and your family. Some thoughts on that one to close up, I think.
Well, this is again why your family has to be around you, because they provide the scaffolding and the strength for you, at the end of a bad day, during a bad day. And but I tell you what, Kathy, and you and I have discussed this about the personal attacks and, the posters that go up around your community with the ugliest photo that they can find of you with nasty messages. But I have to say that marriage equality campaign for 20 years really toughens you up, because it is the personal insults that are thrown at you about, talking about same-sex discrimination and about your relationship, and, the sort of, the loss of personal privacy, the attacks on you personally. The one piece of advice that I would give to anybody who is going into this arena is that it can be tough, but focus on the issues. In the end, you're there because of the issues, and you're going into this to do good, right? And you can't do good without being in it, and you can't be in it without people trying to damage you. And I think that the best advice that I can give is to really focus on the issues. And this the other issue that I would recommend to people is to make sure that you understand that winning is amazing, but you may not win, and that has to be okay too.
Oh, that's so good. That's such a good place to end. So can I blow my love to you in Sydney, and to your next efforts with being Lord Mayor, and to thank you for what you've done. And that 8 months, I think, not only it changed me, it showed what's possible. And I think your presentation today has done that for everybody. So clap all around, and thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Now we're going to take a 5-minute leg stretch. Don't run away from your computer. We're going to be back on by my clock at, let's go 5 minutes past 11. 11:05 Eastern Daylight Savings Time. See you in a moment. Thank you so much, Kerryn. That was amazing.
Thank you very much, Jill. And thank you, everyone. We'll see